Welcome to the 10th tutorial of my Tableau Server Client series. This series is dedicated to showcasing how to use Tableau Server Client to automate various tasks. In this video, I will walk you through the process of generating a report containing important details on each of these subscriptions maintained on your Tableau server. I will show you how to query your Tableau server for information on each subscription using Tableau Server Client and subsequently write that information to an Excel workbook. Before jumping into the coding aspect of this video, allow me to speak to this type of report's use cases. A subscription report allows you to understand what your Tableau server looks like in terms of subscriptions. It allows you to answer questions like, how many subscriptions does our Tableau server currently maintain? How many workbooks and views does each user subscribe to? What is the most popular workbook or view in terms of number of subscribed users? A workbook or view's popularity in terms of number of subscribed users may hint that the content is highly valued by your audience. Understanding if that's the case and why may provide useful insight into what matters and what works. Recreating that piece of content success with your users is a worthwhile goal. A subscriptions report also allows you to capture the details of each subscription and answer questions like, which workbook or view is the subscription associated with? Who owns the workbook or view associated with the subscription? What is the subscription schedule? Having briefly discussed the use cases, I will now jump over to Visual Studio Code to begin writing a script to generate a report on the subscriptions maintained on my Tableau server. For this example, I am going to send a request to my Tableau server to provide a list of all subscriptions existing on the server. After retrieving that list of subscription objects, I will start by creating a simple report that provides important details on each subscription. I will then further develop the structure and contents of this report by incorporating what you learned in my video on generating a user's report to include each subscription owner's details within the report. At the end of this walkthrough, I will show you how to write the report to an Excel file for reporting and dissemination purposes. The first step I need to take is to configure my connection to the Tableau server. If you are unfamiliar with how to configure a connection to your Tableau server for authentication purposes, please watch video 2 of this series. In that video, I walk through connecting to Tableau server for the first time. I will also place the link to the video in the comments section. After configuring the connection details, I can begin working towards a solution that will generate the desired subscriptions report. I need to use the Tableau Server Client object I configured in the first code block to sign in. I have went ahead and started off the second code block by doing just that. I am using a context manager to ensure I stay signed in while attempting to access information on my Tableau server. Additionally, this ensures that I also sign out each time. Alright, before jumping into the coding aspect of this tutorial, I want to do things a little bit differently compared to my previous videos on generating reports using Tableau Server Client. I want to first show the report before we jump into coding, because this report is actually going to take a few of the things that we've learned in previous videos and combine that with new learnings, such as using the subscriptions endpoint to gather subscription info. Let's go ahead and look at the report that we're trying to build. In this report, we're going to capture subscription information. So in this case, we're going to capture the ID associated with the subscription. We're going to capture the ID of the user that owns that subscription. So who is it being sent to? The subject. So this is the email subject that is captured. The schedule. So in this case, we have a subscription that's on a monthly interval that is sent out at 7:15 and it's sent out on the 1st of each month. The name of the person that owns the subscription, the email address associated with that person, their site role, and now also the content, right? So what is being sent to the user? In this case, what's being sent to the user is a view with an ID of this, a name. So the view name is data alert duplicates, the URL associated with that content, the content owner ID. So who owns the content? So we're sending a snapshot of this view to a user that may or may not be a snapshot of content that they actually own, right? They created. It could be somebody else's published workbook or view that was created, and they just wanted that information sent to them via email. And in this case, the content owner is me, and the owner email address, and the content owner site role. So this is what we're going to strive for when we're building this report. And it's important that we understand that we need to access multiple endpoints here, right? So we need to access a new endpoint that we haven't went over before, which is going to be subscriptions endpoint. We need to access the user's endpoint. So again, who owns the subscription? And to get the owner information, we have to tie the subscription ID in the subscription object to a user object, right, with the same ID. And the content, right, we're going to tie the subscription back to the content. So we're going to look at the workbooks and views endpoints, which we've already looked at before. All right, so having explained that, let's go ahead and jump in the code now. So I'm going to switch over and let's get started. So to get started, I'm going to run this initial block that is going to create our Tableau Server Client object. I'm going to use that object to sign in. And the first thing we'll do is we'll gather our subscriptions info using the subscriptions endpoint. So I'm going to say subscriptions equal subscription for subscription in tsc.pager server.subscriptions. All right, so this is going to access the subscriptions endpoint to create a list of subscription objects maintained on my server using list comprehension. All right, let's go ahead and run this. We'll look at that list of subscription objects. Here it is. And then let's also look at the attributes maintained for each. So we'll do that by just doing _dict to look at the dictionary representation. All right, so we have quite a few attributes. Again, what we're going to do here is we're going to capture the ID. So we saw previously in the report that I just showcased, we're going to capture the ID of the subscription. We're going to capture the owner ID, which is going to be the user ID. Again, the user ID is the ID associated with the user object for which this snapshot of the content or view is being sent to. Who is it being sent to? That's this person, or the ID associated with this person. The subject, so this is the subject in the email. We're also going to send the content ID. So the content ID in this case is the target ID. So what does that look like? So we have an attribute called target, or a key called target within this dictionary. And the value is going to be a target item. So to look at that target, let's go ahead and take a look. We can already see right here that this is going to be the target ID, and this is the target type. So the two types are going to be view or workbook that can be sent via subscription. And this is the ID of that view. So if we just were to drill a little further into this, and I say .target _dict, we see, okay, same thing, ID associated with the view and the type of the content, which is a view. So we're going to capture that information too. We want to know whether the subscription content being sent is a view or a workbook. The last thing we want to capture for each of these subscriptions is going to be the schedule. To get that, we're going to say schedule, and then we're going to access the first item in the list returned for each schedule. And we're going to say, give me the interval item. This is going to tell me whether this is a monthly, daily, weekly, etc. type of schedule, when it runs, and the dates for which it runs, or the dates. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have a monthly schedule that starts at 7:15, and it runs on a monthly basis on the 1st of the month. Okay, so we have our subscription information. That's what we're going to capture. Let's go ahead and walk through or add to our code the gathering of workbooks. So I'm going to gather all workbook objects. And we're going to do the same thing, right? So we're going to say workbooks equal workbook for workbook in tsc.pager server.workbooks. So same idea, access an endpoint. In this case, it's the workbooks endpoint. Create a list of workbook objects maintained on the server. And then let's take a look at that, right? So same process, access the first, or technically any workbook item in the list. Take a look at its attributes. We have quite a few attributes that are captured or maintained for each workbook object. The ones that we're going to capture today for this report, and as you saw previously, we're going to capture the ID. So the ID associated with the target, right? So if you remember just this moment ago, we looked at the subscriptions object, and there was a target ID. And that's going to be how we tie a workbook or a view to each other, right? We're going to say, okay, I need to tie this workbook ID to a target ID that's associated with this subscription, if there is one. Let's also capture the content owner ID. So who owns this? That's going to be, where is it? Right here. Okay, so the owner ID in this case is going to be the user ID. So this is going to be the user ID of the person that owns or has published this content. This is not the subscription owner. This is the owner of the content that is being sent to the subscription owner via email, right? Okay, so we also want the content name. So what is the name of the content that's being sent? That's here. In this case, this is an example workbook called Superstore that you're probably all familiar with. And also we want the URL. So providing this information it allows us to, or allows the user to easily click the link and navigate to that page, right, where the content is showcased. All right, so let's do the same thing. We understand workbooks. Let's go ahead and look at the views endpoint in gathering all views. So I'm going to say views is equal to view for view and tsc.pager server.views. Same thing, different endpoint. Take a look at this. Views, we have quite a few views. So views, I don't really like this word, the way Tableau Server and just the library uses view to describe a worksheet in a workbook. So view is synonymous with worksheet in a workbook. So each individual sheet that you've published in a workbook is called a view. So just remember that. So we have quite a few views because obviously there's like a one-to-many relationship between workbooks. So you'll have one view per worksheet in a workbook. And let's take a look at an individual view object. So we have some similar attributes maintained for each view. The owner ID, so who created this view. We also have a content URL, which is not complete, so to speak, right? You couldn't provide this to somebody and they click on it and it navigate them to a page that contains the relevant view. We'll fix that here later on. But we do have a view ID, which is important. So we're going to tie that back to a subscription, right? So the target ID where it matches this. We also want to get the content name, so the view name. In this case, it's overview. And I already mentioned the URL. Okay. So we have all of our list of objects. So we have subscription objects maintained in a list called subscriptions. We have workbook objects maintained in a list called workbooks. We have all of our view objects maintained in a list called views. Let's start by creating a few data frames to capture information for each of these types of objects. So I'm just going to say create a data frame containing subscription information. To do that, let's just say subscription info equals PD data frame. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide a list of key value pairs. So the keys are going to be the name of our columns in our data frame, and the values are going to be a series of list comprehensions that extract a particular attribute, the ones that we want, for each subscription object in the list of subscriptions. So let's go ahead and walk through that. So I'm going to say subscription ID. And that's going to be equal to subscription.id for subscription and subscriptions. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this just so we get the general idea of what's going on. So I have a column called subscription ID, and then I'm going to use list comprehension to iterate through the subscriptions list. So this is a list of subscription objects. And for each of those subscriptions, I'm going to extract the ID and place that within a row. So let's go ahead and run this, and I'll just go ahead and put this down here at the bottom. And take a look at what we have. So we have one row per subscription ID, or per subscription technically. And captured within each of those rows are the IDs that we extracted from each. All right, so we're going to use the same idea to capture each of the attributes for each subscription in a single row. Okay, so the next one thing we want is we want the owner ID. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste a few of these, just so I'm not sitting here doing a typing exercise. So we need 6 attributes. And then let's go ahead and fill these in. So I want the owner ID, I want the subject. So that's going to be the subject of the email being sent. The content ID, the ID, so in this case it's the target ID, but we're going to call it a content ID, so we're using As you'll see, we're going to create data frames for workbooks and views. We'll call those content IDs just for ease in merging these data frames here in a moment. So content ID, content type. The two types of contents that can be sent via subscription are workbooks and views. And then the last thing is going to be the schedule. So we will say, and I'm just going to copy and paste this again. So we'll say owner ID. Here we'll say subject. This is going to be target ID. This is going to be target type. I actually need to, so if you remember correctly, in the subscription object, there is an attribute maintained called target, and it's a key, right? But the value of that is a target item. So what I need to do is actually to access that information, I need to say target dot, and I will say target dot ID. This will be target dot type. Same thing for schedule. So for the schedule, I need to access the schedule attribute, and I need to access the first item in the list returned from that. And then after doing that, I'm going to access the interval item. So that one's a doozy. Kind of painful to get to what you need, but that's how it is currently. So let's go ahead and run this, make sure there's no errors, and there is an error, so it's owner ID. So this is going to be user ID. That's kind of the confusing part. As you begin working more and more with these, you are going to find that, hey, depending on the endpoint or the object I'm using, it may be user ID, it may be owner ID. It just depends on how it's been set up, right? So in this case, it's user ID, not owner ID. I'm still going to call it owner ID because I just like that. I like that terminology a little bit better. All right. So we have our subscription info. Let's go ahead and look at the data frame produced. So we have one row per subscription in this data frame, the corresponding IDs, owner IDs, the subjects that are present in the emails, the content ID, the content type, and the schedule. So again, what we have here, this owner ID is the person the subscription is being sent to. This content ID is the ID associated with the workbook or view. A snapshot's being sent to the user, right? So in this case, it's a view. In this case, it's a workbook. Okay, and we have the schedule. So we have all the information we want for our report that's directly subscription related. The things we need to gather now are the information associated with the content that's being sent to the user. So the workbook information and the view information. So let's do the same thing, create a data frame containing workbook information. And this is going to look pretty much identical, right? Except the attributes for which we're accessing. So the strategy is identical. So we're going to provide a list of key value pairs, the keys being the columns we want in our reports that are going to describe the workbook. I'm going to call this content ID. Instead of workbook ID, I'll call it content ID. And we're going to say workbook.id for workbook in workbooks. So similar to up here, we're going to iterate through the workbooks list. So this is a list of workbook objects that I previously extracted by accessing the server.workbooks endpoint. And I'm going to extract for each of those workbooks in that list, I'm going to extract the ID to represent those in individual rows. Let's go ahead and just copy and paste again. Next thing I want the owner ID. And then we want the name and the URL. All right, to do that, we're going to go ahead and say owner ID. Yeah, and here's that fun part, right? We switch from being user ID to describe the person that corresponds to the content or the subscription to owner ID. This is going to be name, and this is going to be web page URL. All right, so let's go ahead and run this. And then let's just look at it. And here's our data frame associated with workbooks. So the information is stored on each workbook object maintained on the server. So we have the ID of the workbook, so the unique identifier. We have the owner ID, so who owns the published workbook. We have the name of that workbook, and then the URL. All right, so I've captured the information associated with each workbook in a workbook info data frame. The next step is to do the same thing, but for the views. So to do that, I'm just going to copy and paste some of this information here. Well, the entire snippet. Call this view info. What I'll do is, let's just do replace here. Let's find workbook and replace that with view. Let's do that in the selection, and let's just replace all. And the reason I can do this is because the attribute names for view objects are largely the same. The one that is not is going to be content URL. We're actually going to need to do a little bit more here to get a valid URL compared to our workbooks objects that contain a web page URL, which is valid in the state that it's returned. Let's go ahead and run this. And let's look at the view info data frame, and you'll see what I mean by the content URL. So in this data frame, we have one row per view maintained on my Tableau server. And again, views are synonymous with worksheets and workbooks, so you have a relationship between workbooks and sheets, which is one to many. So we have quite a few views, and for each of these views, we maintain the content ID, the owner ID, the content name, and the URL. But this is obviously not a valid URL. So what I want to do is I want to actually structure our URL to look like the web page URL values that are returned for workbooks. So let's just look at that. And I'm going to do that. I'm just going to access the first workbook object within our list of workbooks that we returned earlier. So let's just do ._dict and go ahead and remove this. You'll notice this is a perfectly valid URL that I could send to a user. They could click and they could subsequently navigate to that workbook. I want to do the same thing, but for views. So what I need to do here is I'm going to take this and do a little bit of concatenation. I'm going to say server.server address. This is going to return this initial portion here, so all the way up through the .com. And then I'm going to concatenate what I know the next portion of this URL looks like, and that's going to be the /# /site /SQL short read, so the name of my site, name of your site in your case, and then the content type. So the content type in this case is going to be views. It's not going to be workbooks. And I'm then going to further concatenate the extraction of the content URL for each view. So the content URL we saw previously, it's not going to help us entirely get us to a valid URL. So what I want to do is I want to take pieces of that. So I'm going to say view.content URL. I'm going to say .replace. And I want to replace this portion of that content URL that was previously returned. I want to replace that with just a /. And what this is going to do is it's going to go through each of those view objects in this data frame, and it's going to take the URL or create the URL using the server address plus this concatenated plus the content URL with this portion of that content URL string that's returned for each view object replaced with just this. Let's go ahead and run this. And what I want to do, let's just go ahead and copy and paste this to see if we maintain the structure. So I'm going to keep this here. And then let's just get view info. And let's do, okay, so this looks correct. So let's just, that's our content URL now. So what I'll be able to do is I'll be able to give this to a user. So when we eventually write this to an Excel workbook, the users are going to be able to, or the consumers of this workbook are going to be able to click these links and navigate to the view, as opposed to having to say, okay, I have this report and I have a contents or a view named overview. Let me go on the front end of my Tableau server and search for overview. That may work, right? It may work if you only have one worksheet across your entire server named overview. But for a term like this, or a term like executive dashboard, that's probably not going to be the case, especially if you have a large user base. So you're going to be returned a list of views that are called overview, or a list of objects. It could be views, it could be workbooks, it could be a combination of those. So obviously you would like the actual URL that contains a direct link to that view in question. Okay, so we have the views. We have a view info data frame. The next thing we need to do is we need to take these two data frames and concatenate them together. So, and the way we're going to concatenate these is exactly like you would do in SQL. You would union them, or in Excel, you would append the data to the pre-existing data range or data sheet. So let's go do that now. And I'm just going to say content info. I'm going to just do vertically concatenate the workbook info and view info data frames. So I'll just call this content info is equal to pd.concat. So we're going to use the concat method. And this is what I need to pass in here is just going to be the list of data frames that I want to vertically append one another. So I'm going to say workbook info, view info, and then because I want to concatenate along the 0 axis, I want to append. So I want to take the data frame workbook info and just vertically append it to the view info data frame, or vice versa. I'm going to use axis is equal to 0. If you do not place this in here, axis is equal to 0, and you do axis is equal to 1 or axis is equal to true, you're going to end up having a data frame that gets wider as opposed to longer, right? So we want to vertically append these things, not horizontally. Okay, so let's look at content info. And now we have our workbook info data frame and view info data frame concatenated. So we have all of the rows that were in both of these data frames in one data frame. And you may be thinking, well, how am I going to differentiate a view from a workbook in this case now? If we weren't going to join this back to, or if we weren't going to merge this back to the subscription info data frame, then we would need to actually tag those, each of the rows originating from the workbook info data frame and view info data frame with the value representing their content type, so workbook versus view. But because we have that information in the actual subscription info data frame, which is basically going to say view or workbook depending on the target type or for that subscription, we don't need to do that. So whenever I merge this back, we're going to merge based on the content ID, which is the target ID, and that target ID is going to be the view ID or the workbook ID corresponding to that subscription's content that's being sent to the user. So we don't need to do that. But in every other scenario where you're merging to another object or you're joining to another object, a data frame, where the content type is not captured, you would need to do that if you wanted to differentiate between workbook and view after concatenating these data frames. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is we have our subscriptions, we have the content that is being sent to the users as part of the subscription in their emails, a snapshot of that content. We have the owner ID of the subscription, but we don't have the actual user information associated with this owner, right? So what can we do? In a previous video, I walked through using the user's endpoint to get the user objects maintained on your server. And as a result of doing that, you're able to capture information related to each user. Let's go ahead and do that now. And if we do that, we're going to be able to say, okay, I have an owner ID, and that owner ID is associated with this user. This is the person that is actually getting this content. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. So create a data frame. So it's going to largely mimic the same structure here. So create a data frame containing user information. Let me just scroll down so I can see. Say user info. Let's go to pd.dataframe. And then we're going to pass in a series of key value pairs. Again, just like the other data frames, the keys are going to be the column names. The values are going to be the attributes we're going to extract from each user object. So let's do that now. So let's do user ID. And then user.id for user and users. And have we not actually extracted this already? So we haven't. So we haven't actually created our list of user objects. So let me go ahead and do that now. So gather all users. And just say users is equal to user for user and tsc.pager server.users. Let's go ahead and run this again. And then now I'll be able to access that list of user objects. And what else do I want? I want going to get the user display name. So who is this user ID associated with? User dot full name for user and users. Let's get the email address as well. And let's get the site role. So this portion here wouldn't be new to you if you've watched any of my previous videos. In most of the previous videos, I have basically used user information for each of those videos, because if we're getting a workbooks report, or we're generating a workbooks report, or we're generating a data sources reports, we always are going to want to know who is the workbook associated with. So who's the owner of that workbook, who's the owner of the data source, who published that workbook or data source. We're always going to want to know that. Missing a comma here. So that's why this comes in handy, right? Because that's going to be the questions your users of your reports ask. They're going to ask, okay, you gave me a bunch of information on workbooks, data sources, subscriptions, but who owns those things, right? It's a natural chain of questioning, right? So you want to have that in your report, so then you don't have to say, okay, one moment, let me go get that for you. And sometimes that won't be just one moment. It might be quite a while. All right, so we have all this information. We have the information for each subscription, the content that is associated with each subscription. We have the user that's receiving that content, that snapshot of the content in their email. Now we need to bring this all together. So this next portion here is going to be a typing exercise for me. We're going to merge these data frames together, so we get that information all in one row for each subscription. So the subscription information, the content information associated with the subscription, and the user that owns it or is receiving that email. We're going to get those captured all in one row for each subscription. By merging those data frames, we're going to do some transformations like dropping redundant columns. We're going to rename some columns, and then we're going to switch the order around in which the columns are represented. So I want to make the column ordering in such a way that it's easier for my users to read the report. So I want the subscription columns to come first, then the content columns, and then the owner columns. So who owns the subscription and who owns the contents, right? That's associated with the subscription. So let's do that now. So this is going to be quite a long typing exercise for me. So I'm just going to say create a subscriptions report by merging. So we're going to merge all of these data frames, excuse me, the subscriptions data frame, workbook, view, and user data frames. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say subscriptions report. So this is going to be our actual report that we're going to output to an Excel workbook. Equals pd.dataframe. And let me scroll down so I can see again. All right, pd.dataframe. And then we're going to say, okay, our first data frame we're going to start with is going to be subscription info. We're going to merge that to what? We're going to merge that to our content info data frame. So that content info data frame is a result of vertically appending or unioning the workbook data info data frame and the view info data frame. All right, so we're going to say right is equal to content info. And we're going to say left on. So how are we going to merge these two data frames, the subscription info data frame and the content info data frame? We're going to merge this on the subscription content ID. So from the subscription info data frame, that's called subscription content ID. And in the content info data frame, that is just simply content ID. So these are the values for which we're going to merge on. And let's just go ahead and run this so we can show this intermediate solution. And let's do report. All right, so this is the result of that first merge. So we've taken our subscriptions info data frame and merged it to our content info data frame. So now we have represented within each row, we have the subscription information, and then we have the actual content information associated with that subscription. So again, that content information is associated with the snapshot of the content, so the workbook review that's being sent to the user via email. All right, so let's keep going. just going to leave that down there because we have quite a few steps to go here. So the first thing I want to do here, if we look at this, do we have any redundant columns? We do. We have, so I'm going to remove subscription content ID because we also have that here, right? So we have the content ID here. This is going to help me ensure that I have subscription info followed by another theme of data, the content info, and then followed by the user info. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that redundant column. Say columns equal, and then let's just drop subscription content ID. Okay. So let's just look at that again. It drops the column. We're good to go. Let's continue. So the next step is we need to merge the user info data frame. So I'm going to say .merge, and I'm going to say right equals user info. And then how are we going to merge these two data frames? We're going to merge them on the owner ID of the subscription and the user ID in the user info data frame. So left on equals subscription owner ID. Right on equals user ID. So this is how, again, how we're going to tie the subscription to an actual user object. Let's see, do I have any mistakes here? So dot drop, dot merge. What am I missing here? So right equals, yeah, left subscription user ID. What am I missing? I know that ran. Oh, the most important part here. Let's see. Go ahead and run this. Invalid 6 text. Forgot a comma, right. Oh, it's just one pesky comma. There we go. All right, so I've ran the report again, and we now see the user information associated with the content is also horizontally appended to each of these rows. So for the subscription owner who this is being sent to, it's being sent to me, or it's being sent to this person. In this case, it's an email address. Let's keep going. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to need to actually rename some of these columns. I'm going to rename because user ID, user display, user email address, and user site role to subscription owner display name, subscription owner email address, subscription owner site role. So just these three here. I'm also going to drop this user ID. And why am I going to drop this? Well, it's redundant because this user ID is associated with this subscription owner ID, right? That's how we merge these two data frames. I don't need that to be repeated twice across two different columns. So let's just do that first. So .drop columns equals user ID. In this next part, so the renaming is entirely optional. I mean, a lot of this stuff is optional, right? You don't have to drop these columns, but I think it's helpful if you don't have redundant attributes or columns in your data frame. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to rename these. I'm going to say columns. I'm going to rename a few of these columns. Columns, and then I'm going to provide a list of key value pairs. So the keys are going to represent the old name. The values are going to represent the new name that I would like. So I'm going to say user display name. And I'm going to replace that with subscription owner display name. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace the user email address with subscription owner email address. So I'm going to be very explicit in what each of these columns represents and the values they contain. The next thing I'm going to replace is user site role, or rename. Okay. So as a result, I'm going to have renamed these three columns. Just go ahead and rerun this. And did I spell something wrong? User display name. No, it's because I didn't put it up here. User display name. All right, so let's rerun this. And now we have subscription owner display name, subscription owner email address, and subscription owner site role. All right, so I've successfully renamed those columns just to be more explicit, and you'll see why here in a moment. We're not done with our merges. We actually need to, well, yeah, we need to merge one more time. So we're going to merge one more time. And the reason we're going to merge another data frame is because we need to get the user information that's associated with the content owner. So who owns the content? So for example, if you have 100 subscriptions being sent out to people and you have a content, let's just say it's this data alert duplicates. This is a highly subscribed piece of content and it's going to 100 people and you know that the owner ID is this. Well, you're going to want to know, okay, who's created this piece of content that is so highly subscribed? Maybe we can reinvent that success, right? Or make that happen again, right? So let me go ahead and do another merge. So I'm going to merge, and what we'll do is we're just going to copy and paste this, right? So copy and paste this. And what I want to do is swap this out for content owner ID, because we're not going to merge on the subscription owner, right? I'm no longer getting the information associated with the subscription owner, the person the email is being sent to. I'm getting it associated with the content that's being snapshotted and sent to that user. So let's go ahead and do that. And this same step's going to apply. I don't need to keep this, right? So I'm going to drop the column, the redundant user ID. Let's go ahead and look at this. So our data frame is getting wider and wider, but it's being enriched with more useful information associated with each subscription. So in this case now, we have the subscription info, the content info, the URL. We also have the subscription owner's information, and then we will have, if I scroll over, we're going to have the user information associated with the content owner. So the content that's being sent to the user. And this is why I'm going to rename this stuff, right? So I have the subscription owner display name, very explicit, which person or user is this associated with, right? This is associated with me, and I'm the subscription owner, the person it's being sent to. I now want to change this, rename this to be content owner display name, content owner email address, content owner site role. So we're going to do the same thing here, right? I'm just going to copy and paste this so you don't have to watch me type again. So let's copy and paste, and let's go ahead and say content, run it again. And now we have columns that are very explicit, easy to read, easy to understand. Subscription information followed by content information, followed by the subscription's user information, who it's being sent to, followed by who owns the content that's being snapshotted and sent to the user. Okay. The last step, again, up until most of this stuff. So the renaming, completely optional, dropping, completely optional. Obviously, you need to merge the data frames in order to get a complete view of this report, right? To have visibility on not only who owns the subscription, but who the user actually is, and the content, and also the content owner information. But this renaming stuff you don't have to do. This next step you don't have to do, but I prefer to do this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to re-index these columns, so shuffle these columns around to be in a more sensible order, in my opinion. So I'm going to say re-index, and then I'm going to say columns is equal to. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put all this subscription information side by side. So in sequential order, the columns are going to be subscription information. Then I'm going to have the owner information associated with that subscription. And then I'm going to have the content information and then the content owner information. So let's do subscription ID. Subscription ID followed by subscription owner ID followed by subscription subject. And hopefully I haven't spelled subscription subject or subscription wrong yet. I'm sure I'll spell it wrong at least once or twice here. What I'll do is actually going to copy and paste this stuff. So let's just do this. It's painful enough to see me type this out, right? There we go. And next line, let's do 3 per row. And then subscription content type. Let's get that. I'll just type that out. So these are the attributes or columns associated with the content that's being snapshotted and sent to the user. Content URL. This is going to allow my users of the reports, the consumers of the reports, to actually just click links as opposed to going to the front end user interface and trying to find what they need. Okay, and final attribute, the content owner site role. So I'm getting all of that from here, right? So if all of those attributes, they're shown here. I'm just reordering them. Let's go ahead and run this. All right, so we have our subscription information, right? So the subscription information, what's going on here? So I spelled, yeah, see, this is where attention to detail really counts. So I spelled subscription owner ID wrong. So yeah, see, I told you how to do it. So subscription. Anywhere you see NAs like that previously had data, that's a misspelling on my end. So content owner display name, where is that? Lowercase n. So these have to be character for character, correct? All right. So we have the subscription information followed by the person's information that owns that subscription. So who's it being sent to? Followed by the content information, followed by the owner of the content. So who's published and created that content that the user is receiving in their email. And yeah, so we have this entire report, ton of useful information that's going to allow you to understand your subscriptions a bit better. So which piece of content is the most highly subscribed to, which user has the most subscriptions, how many subscriptions are maintained on your server, how can I get to each of the pieces of content that is being sent to the user in the subscription, right? So if I see I have 100 subscriptions related to data alert missing data, I can just click on one of these links, right? So I can click on one of the associated links to get there. What is the schedule? So in this case, this is being ran on the 1st of the month on a monthly interval at 7:15 a.m. A lot of useful information. But this information is not particularly useful if I just keep it here in my IDE, right? I need to actually be able to disseminate this and get this in front of people. Or so get this in front of people in an Excel workbook, or maybe even publish this as a Tableau published data source on my server. I can do a lot with this, but I can do very little if I just keep this to myself here. So let's go ahead and write this to an Excel workbook. So this is going to look just like the Excel workbook that you saw at the beginning of this video, at this coding section. Let's do that now. I'm just going to copy and paste this snippet of code, and I'll walk you through it. I don't think there's really much to gain from me hand typing out a path to write to, and then using Pandas' Excel writer. But I will explain it. Just not much value in you sitting here watching me type it out. So let's go ahead and do this. And this is the code. If you've watched my other videos, this is the same code that I use across all of my other videos. The only thing that's going to be different is going to be the sheet name and the path I'm running to. So in this case, let's just walk through here. So I have pathlib, so I'm using pathlib. If you saw at the very beginning here, you may have been wondering, well, why is he importing pathlib? All right, so I'm importing pathlib because I'm going to create a path. So this is the path that I'm going to write to. So I'm writing to tutorial 10 folder and writing a report called subscriptions report followed by an underscore, followed by the date and time for which this report or this code block was executed. The reason I do this is I think it's extremely important to ensure that you're not overwriting another report in the same exact directory. And this is going to allow you to distinguish one report from another. So over the lifetime of this code, or you managing your server, you're not going to run one report, right? You're going to maybe run one report today, tomorrow, next week, next month. You may run it on at some frequency, right? And you're going to want to distinguish one of those, say, weekly reports from another weekly report. So that's why this is incredibly important. It's going to append the date and time for which the report was executed or generated. And this little snippet piece is just a standard piece of code that's going to say, hey, use the right path, write to that. And what am I going to write? I'm going to write the subscriptions report data frame to an Excel with a sheet name called subscriptions. If you don't put a sheet name in here, it's going to be sheet 1. So the same that would occur if you open up a workbook and you haven't renamed the sheet. Index is equal to false. I always use this option. And the reason I do is because Excel already has a built-in row numbering system. I don't need this redundant row numbering system that starts at 0. So I'm going to say, let's not include that. Let's go ahead and run this. And then what I'll do is I'll switch over to Excel. So you're probably seeing a black screen right now because I haven't opened up Excel yet. And let's go ahead and get this now. So I'm opening it up, and here is our report. Okay, so this is exactly what you saw in my IDE, right? So we have our subscription information. We have the owner that owns that subscription, so who this subscription is being sent to via email. We have the content associated with the subscription, so which content is being sent to the user, the snapshot. We have the URL for that content. And we have the content owner information. So this piece of content that's being sent to two people who created that piece of content. Well, that's me. This is the owner ID. This is my email address, site role, etc. Okay, that wraps up this video on generating a subscriptions report. I hope you found this tutorial useful and can use the concepts I've covered to level up your ability to manage your own Tableau server through automation. If you enjoyed this video, then please like the video and subscribe to my channel for notifications on future videos. Thank you again, and see you next time.